Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty fascinating, a peek inside an early copy of a UFO investigation textbook. It's from the Bald and Bonkers Network Academy.
That's right. It's called Investigating UFO Phenomenon. And it's sort of positioned as a handbook for anyone wanting to seriously look into these unexplained aerial sightings.
Okay, so for this deep dive, our mission seems pretty straightforward. We want to, unpack this textbook, dig into its core ideas, the methods it suggests.
Yeah, and really figure out if it offers a solid foundation for you. If you're thinking about becoming, let's say, a responsible investigator in this, well, let's be honest, often confusing field.
Exactly. What does it really say it's important? Let's jump right in.
Okay, so where the textbook really kicks things off is by stressing something absolutely crucial. You've got to approach this whole subject with rigor and a good amount of skepticism.
Right. It's not about just wanting to believe.
No, not at all. It's about applying critical thinking. The core idea, really, is that separating fact from, speculation or fiction in this area demands that scientific skepticism and really careful, meticulous data collection.
So the book's saying, basically, you can only really contribute something useful if you stick to these kinds of rigorous standards.
Precisely. It argues that's the only way to make a meaningful contribution.
Which means, first things first, try ruling out everything else it could possibly be.
Absolutely. Oh. And a massive part of that, according to this textbook, is getting your head around just how easily we misidentify things. It really digs into the human side, the natural stuff that leads to mistaken sightings.
You mean like our brains just playing tricks on us? Or seeing things wrong?
Yeah, definitely. Psychological factors, simple optical illusions, they play a huge role. The textbook talks quite a bit about confirmation bias, that tendency we all have to see what we expect to see or maybe what we want to see.
Yeah. Like you see a weird light, maybe you've been browsing UFO forums all day and bam, your brain jumps to flying saucer, even if it's, I don't know, just a plane reflecting the sunset weirdly.
That's exactly the kind of pitfall the book warns about. And, poor viewing conditions just make it worse. Bad light, if it's really far away, things in the way, distractions.
Makes sense.
And honestly, the book points out that a lot of the initial reports people make are just, well, frustratingly vague. They lack the kind of specific details you'd actually need to figure out what might have happened.
Okay, but what about things that are naturally weird up there? I mean, the atmosphere does some crazy stuff sometimes.
It really does. And the book covers a lot of these natural phenomena that often get mistaken for UAPs. Atmospheric effects are a big one. Things like light bending, refraction, in unusual ways, mirages.
Well, yeah, like those heat shimmers off a road.
That kind of thing, yeah. But it even gets specific about superior mirages, which need particular atmospheric conditions.
Right.
And weird clouds, like lenticular clouds, or those really high noctilucent ones, they can look very odd.
So knowing a bit about weather, about meteorology, that actually helps a lot here.
Massively. The book really stresses that understanding basic weather patterns, atmospheric optics, it's essential. It also covers electrical stuff like ball lightning, and even those flashes high up, sprites, elves, jets.
Wow.
Knowing these things exist is like step one in not immediately calling them something unexplained.
And then there's just looking up at night, a lot going on besides the usual stars.
For sure. The book spends time on astronomical phenomena too. Meteors, obviously. Planets can be surprisingly bright, fireballs, and satellites, of course.
Oh, satellites must cause a ton of confusion. They move differently. They don't twinkle like stars.
They absolutely do. The book specifically says, learn about different satellite types, even geostationary ones, which seem to stay still. Learn how to tell them apart from planets or stars.
How?
Well, it recommends using online tools, things like Heavens Above or Stellarium software. You can check exactly what should be visible in the sky at that specific time and location. Basically, it's saying you need solid astronomy basics and the right tools to check.
And checking for normal planes, too, I assume?
Oh, absolutely crucial. The book suggests checking local weather reports first, using weather apps, maps, and definitely using flight tracking sites. FlightAware, ADS-B Exchange, things like that. Cross-referencing your sighting with all these known possibilities is just fundamental.
Okay. So you've seen something. You've tried to rule out the obvious stuff, planes, satellites, weird weather. Maybe you even got a photo on your phone. What does the book say about that actual evidence? Because, let's face it, most stuff online is just blurry blobs.
The textbook is very direct about the limits of photos and videos. It lists the common problems. Low resolution, bad lighting, no sense of scale or context. Without that context, yeah, a blob is just a blob. You can't tell much.
Yeah, it's really hard to make anything out from a shaky, dark video of a distant light someone took on their phone.
Exactly. And the book notes how easily normal things will bend. Birds, distant aircraft, even lens flares or reflections inside the camera can look really strange and anomalous in low-quality footage or under tricky conditions.
And then you see those videos online that look almost too good, like suspiciously clear.
Right. The book explicitly warns about manipulated videos or ones that have been digitally enhanced way too much. It stresses you absolutely need to examine footage critically. You have to be aware that altering videos is easier than ever, and a lot of what circulates probably isn't genuine.
So distinguishing real from fake means knowing what to look for, being really cautious.
Very cautious. Knowing the signs of alteration, yeah.
Okay, so given all those problems, misidentification, poor evidence quality, outright fakes, how does the textbook say you should go about documenting a sighting properly if you want to do it right?
This is where it really lays out a rigorous data collection protocol.
Yeah.
The whole point is to move way beyond just saying, hey, I saw something weird. It's about gathering detailed, objective information.
All right, lay it out for us. What are the absolute must-haves the book insists you record?
Okay, number one, precise timing. The book even mentions using UTC Universal Time Coordinated to avoid any ambiguity with time zones. Location is vital. GPS coordinates if you can get them, but also street addresses, landmarks nearby, compass bearings to the objects, maybe topographical details.
And taking pictures of where you are.
Yes. Photos of your surroundings to document the context.
Yeah.
And trying to estimate the altitude or your elevation. That's key too.
So not just it was over there, but more like it was at a bearing of 280 degrees true north from my position at the corner of Main and Elm Street, elevation about 500 feet.
Exactly. That level of precision. The book argues that kind of detail is what makes a report actually usable, reliable for analysis later. It's the difference between just a story and, a potentially valuable data point.
Gotcha. What about describing the thing itself?
Again, the push is for detailed, objective descriptions. For shape, use specific terms. Was it spherical, cylindrical, triangular, disc-shaped, irregular? It specifically says, avoid vague terms like round or craft in your initial notes. Be descriptive first.
Like the example it uses a diamond-shaped object.
Yeah, it gives that example. A roughly diamond-shaped object. And it emphasizes describing characteristics objectively. So its color was a deep metallic blue. Or noting a specific light pattern like it emitted a pulsating red light from its lower point, pulsing about once per second. Be specific.
Estimating size must be really hard, though.
It is, definitely. But the book suggests ways to try. Estimate its size relative to known objects, maybe about the size of a car if it was at that distance, or compare its apparent size in the sky to something like the full moon. It mentions angular size too, but focuses more on practical comparisons.
And color, brightness, how it moved.
Describe the color and brightness accurately. Note if it was solid or if it changed, maybe iridescent. Movement needs specifics. Was it stationary? Hovering? Did it accelerate suddenly? Make abrupt turns? What was its speed? Its direction relative to north, south, east, west? Was the movement smooth or kind of jerky?
Duration. Lights. Sounds.
Yeah, record the duration precisely from when you first saw it to when it disappeared. Describe any lights, their color, intensity, were they steady, flashing, pulsating, any patterns, how many lights, where were they arranged on the object? And sounds, describe them specifically, like a high-pitched whine or a low rumble, and mention if you managed to get any audio recording.
And you should list all the gear you used. Camera, phone, whatever.
Oh, absolutely essential. The make, model, any specs you know for cameras, binoculars, what settings were used if you know them. This is crucial for anyone analyzing the data later to understand its quality and limitations. And one more thing the book strongly recommends, make a sketch or a diagram.
Even if you're, terrible at drawing.
It really stresses this. Even a simple drawing can capture the shape, the proportions, key features, even the movement path in a way that words sometimes can't. You could even do multiple sketches if it changed appearance or moved significantly. Using a consistent scale or adding a legend helps too. It really highlights the value of this often overlooked step.
Okay, right. So you've got your detailed notes, maybe that sketch, and you tried to get photos or video. What about the technical side of actually capturing those images? Does the book get into that?
Oh yeah, it goes into quite a bit of detail on equipment and technique. It argues pretty strongly, actually, that using high-quality equipment is really important if you want to get usable data, not just blurry lights.
So what kind of gear does it recommend? Are we talking fancy cameras?
It discusses DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, points out their big advantage is interchangeable lenses, and it really emphasizes that a good telephoto lens is pretty much essential for getting any detail on distant objects. Much better than just using digital zoom on a phone or basic camera. It does mention point and shoots, but mainly to highlight their limitations for this kind of work.
What specific camera features does it say are important?
Image stabilization is a big one, especially optical stabilization, the kind built into the lens or camera body. That's crucial for keeping things steady, particularly when you're zoomed in with a telephoto lens or shooting in low light. Fast shutter speeds are also key, obviously, to freeze motion and avoid blur if the object is moving.
And manual controls.
It encourages using manual controls for more flexibility, yeah. But that does mean you need to understand basic photography principles. Aperture, shutter speed, ISO, focus. It's not just point and shoot.
Any accessories it calls out.
A sturdy tripod is practically called mandatory, especially if you're using telephoto lenses or need longer exposures in the dark. A remote shutter release, or using the camera's timer, helps avoid shaking the camera when you take the shot. And if sound is part of the event, it suggests using external microphones for much better audio quality than the tiny mic built into most cameras.
Focusing must be a nightmare in the dark on a tiny distant object.
It really is, and the book acknowledges that challenge. It recommends using manual focus, not relying on autofocus, which will likely struggle. If your camera has features like live view with magnification, that can help you nail the focus. It suggests maybe focusing on a bright star or a distant streetlight first, and then locking that focus before aiming at the object.
And for recording videos specifically, anything different?
Again, tripods and image stabilization are key to minimize that shaky cam effect we see so often. You need to be aware of how the atmosphere itself can distort the image, especially over long distances, and just the inherent limitations of your gear. And just like with photos, keeping a detailed log of the recording circumstances, settings, conditions is emphasized.
Okay, so you've managed to get the raw footage, the photos. The book talks about post-processing them, like editing them. Is that something an investigator should even be doing? Seems risky.
It says it could be a valuable tool, for potentially enhancing clarity, maybe bringing out some faint details, basically increasing the analytical value of what you captured. But this is where the textbook gets extremely cautious.
Cautious how? What's the risk?
The absolute crucial rule, stressed repeatedly in the book, is minimal and transparent documentation. This is where it gets, really critical for maintaining credibility.
Minimal and transparent, meaning don't mess with it much, and if you do, document everything.
Exactly. Overprocessing your evidence is a huge danger. It can easily compromise the integrity of the original data, and worse, it can introduce artifacts, things that look like they're part of the object or event, but were actually created by the editing process itself.
Right, like you sharpen it too much and suddenly there are weird edges that weren't really there.
Precisely. The book gives examples of common tools and their potential pitfalls. Noise reduction might blur out fine details you actually needed to see. Sharpening, like you said, can create artificial edges or textures. Pushing the contrast too hard can lead to clipping, where you lose all detail in the very bright or very dark areas. Even simple color correction, if done poorly, can make things look unnatural. And if you're dealing with older interlaced video, de-interlacing can introduce its own set of motion artifacts.
Wow. So trying to make it look better can actually make it much less accurate evidence.
Exactly. That's the core warning. The book absolutely insists, always make backup copies of your original untouched files before you even think about editing. And then you must meticulously record every single adjustment you make, what software you used, what specific settings, what order you did things in. That transparency is non-negotiable if you want the evidence to be taken seriously.
It even mentions open source software options like OpenShot or Kdenlive.
Right, which shows you don't necessarily need super expensive professional software, but you absolutely do need to understand how these tools work and the potential damage they can do if misused.
All right, so you've collected everything, the detailed notes, the sketches, the photos, the videos. Maybe you've done some very minimal, carefully documented processing. How does the textbook say you should actually analyze all this data?
The analysis process, according to the book, starts with a really objective look at everything you've gathered. It stresses doing an initial visual inspection, carefully noting those precise timestamps you recorded, and writing purely descriptive, objective accounts in your analysis notes.
Like sticking to the facts, Roughly triangular shape with three bright lights instead of jumping to look like an alien spaceship.
Exactly that. You had to consciously separate the raw observational data from your own analysis or interpretation, especially in your reports. Considering potential explanations, trying to identify it as something known that comes after you've thoroughly documented and analyzed the raw data objectively.
And thinking about things that could distort the recording itself.
Yes, definitely. Understanding how atmospheric effects like haze, fog, heat shimmer, or even lens flare might have affected your photos or video, and also being aware of purely technical artifacts, camera shake, introducing blur, motion blur from the object moving fast, compression artifacts from the video format itself. You need to consider all those possibilities.
Does the book get into more technical or scientific forms of analysis beyond just looking at pictures?
It does mention a few, yeah, but usually with the caveat that these often require specialized expertise or equipment, maybe even collaboration. Spectral analysis is one example.
Analyzing the light itself.
Right. Using spectrometers, it even mentions inexpensive options might exist to look at the spectrum of light emitted or reflected by the object. The idea is you might be able to identify specific elements, like sodium or mercury lines, if it turns out to be, say, a distant streetlight. But the book also talks about analyzing the shape or width of spectral lines for potential clues about temperature or velocity, though it cautions UAPs might behave erratically, making this really challenging.
What about other kinds of data, like EMF readings? People sometimes talk about those.
It mentions electromagnetic field data, EMF, yes. But it immediately states this requires significant expertise. You'd need to differentiate any potential signal from natural background noise, which isn't easy. It strongly suggests collaborating with someone experienced in electromagnetics if you have that kind of data.
And radar data. That seems more objective.
It covers the basics of understanding radar principles, like how it detects moving targets. But again, the emphasis is on the complexities. Radar data can have its own sources of error and ambiguity. Interpretation isn't always straightforward. Combining radar data with other evidence, like visual sightings, is key. It mentions concepts like triangulation if you have data from multiple radar sources.
It even dips into underwater sightings with sonar, right? That seems pretty niche.
It does, briefly. It mentions sonar's unique ability to see underwater, but then immediately dives into the significant challenges. The underwater environment is incredibly variable. Temperature, salinity, pressure, all mess with sound speed. Marine life creates clutter. Sound energy gets absorbed differently depending on frequency. It's complex.
So lots of variables.
Huge variables. Different types of sonar have different issues. Processing the signals needs extra techniques, noise reduction, filtering, pattern identification. And the book warns you need to understand potential biases in the algorithms used for processing.
So sonar analysis, according to the book, is definitely another call an expert situation.
Oh, absolutely. It explicitly stresses collaborating with specialists in underwater acoustics or oceanography. And critically, cross-referencing any sonar data with other evidence, visual sightings from the surface, magnetic readings, maybe even water samples, and making sure all these different data streams are properly synchronized in time.
It really sounds like, based on this textbook, getting to the bottom of a potentially significant sighting requires a whole team approach almost, pulling in different kinds of expertise.
What's interesting here, I think, is how consistently the book hammers this point home. Serious investigation is complex. It often requires specialized knowledge that goes way beyond what one person, even a dedicated investigator, is likely to possess on their own.
Right. And speaking of involving others, what about the original witnesses? The people who actually saw the thing? Their testimony is usually the starting point, isn't it?
Witness accounts are incredibly important. The book states that clearly. They're often the only data you have initially. But they must be approached with critical analysis. Human memory, human perception. They're just not perfect recording devices.
So how does the textbook suggest you interview a witness effectively to get the best, most accurate information possible?
The setting is important. It recommends somewhere quiet, private, ideally face-to-face or at least a video call where you can see their expressions. Pick up on nonverbal cues. First step is establishing rapport.
Making them feel comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. Explain why you're talking to them. Assure them their account is valuable. Maintain confidentiality. Make it really clear you're not judging them. There are no right or wrong answers. You just want to understand what they experienced as best they recall it.
What are the key questions the book says you need to ask?
It provides a pretty good list of core areas to cover. What exactly happened, step by step? Where and when did it occur? How long did the whole event last? Can they describe the object in detail: shape, size, color, features? Describe its movement speed, direction, changes. Describe any lights or sounds. Were there any other unusual observations, smells, effects on electronics, anything? Were other witnesses present? Did they manage to get any photos or videos? Did they report it to anyone else, like police or aviation authorities? And importantly, what was their emotional reaction during and after the event?
And while they're talking, you need to be really listening, right? Not just ticking boxes.
Active listening is crucial. The book emphasizes paying close attention, not just to what they say, but how they say it. Their tone of voice, any hesitation, their body language. These can offer insights into their confidence, their stress levels, their sincerity. Take detailed notes, obviously, and if they consent, make an audio or even video recording of the interview itself.
And after the interview, what's the follow-up process?
You need to create a detailed report, a summary of the account, ideally a full transcription, or at least very thorough notes from your recording. Include your own observations about the interview and the witness's demeanor. Then, make sure everything is stored securely and maintain that confidentiality you promised.
The book gets into the psychology of memory too, doesn't it? How memory isn't always reliable.
Yeah, it delves into that quite deeply. It makes the point that memory isn't like replaying a perfect video. So many things can influence it. A witness's prior beliefs about UFOs, their general psychological state at the time, these can shape what they recall and how they describe it. High stress or fear during the event, the book even mentions the role of the amygdala in the brain, can significantly affect memory formation and recall, sometimes leading to selective memory, where you only remember certain parts vividly.
And what about external influences, like hearing other people's stories or seeing stuff online after the event?
That's a huge point the book makes, calls it misinformation contamination. If a witness is exposed to other accounts, media reports, maybe speculation on social media, or especially those potentially edited videos we talked about, it can subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, alter their own memory of the event over time. They might start incorporating details they heard elsewhere without realizing it.
Wow, so the interviewer has to be careful too.
Absolutely. The book warns that leading questions from the interviewer, or even subtle nonverbal cues, can unintentionally influence a witness's recall. That's why it strongly emphasizes using open-ended questions. What did you see next? Can you describe the movement? Rather than closed or leading questions like, was it definitely metallic? Or did it seem hostile?
So getting a detailed written statement from the witness as soon as possible after they saw something, before they talk to too many people or see too much online, that's really valuable.
Very much so, according to the textbook. It highlights the value of statements obtained quickly before that potential contamination can set in. And it stresses that the process doesn't end with the first interview. Thorough follow-up is necessary, reviewing the transcript or notes, verifying details where possible, like checking weather records or flight paths, gently exploring any inconsistencies, and following up on any leads mentioned by the witness.
Okay, so we've got interview transcripts, maybe written statements, photos, videos, detailed observation notes, maybe even technical data like radar logs if you're lucky. That's potentially a huge amount of information for just one case. How does the textbook suggest you manage all of that effectively?
Yeah, organization and archiving. The book calls this absolutely paramount for any serious investigation. It says without a good system, you'll just drown in data and things will get lost or confused very quickly.
What does a good system look like, according to the book?
It recommends a clear, consistent file structure, like a hierarchical system. Maybe a main folder called UFO Investigations, then subfolders for each specific case, maybe named by date or location. And within each case folder, more subfolders for different types of data, witness testimonies, photographs, video footage, analysis reports, correspondence, things like that.
And the file names themselves, not just IMG001.
Definitely not. Descriptive file names are key. Instead of something meaningless, use a consistent format like, say, 2023-10-27 witness object 1 photo.jpg, including the date, maybe a witness identifier, what the file is. Using relevant keywords in file names and perhaps in file metadata is also really helpful for searching and retrieval later. The absolute key, it stresses, is consistency across all your files.
So maybe using a spreadsheet or even a simple database to keep track of everything.
Exactly. The book suggests creating an index or a spreadsheet. You can link the file names, dates, locations, main keywords, maybe cross-reference related files. Whether you use a simple spreadsheet or a more complex database really depends on the scale of your investigation, how many cases and files you're handling.
And thinking about keeping this data safe long-term.
Yeah, it touches on long-term preservation too. Things like periodically auditing your data to check for file corruption or integrity issues, using lossless compression formats if you need to save space, or migrate files to new storage media over time. The underlying goal is to ensure the data remains accessible and usable for future analysis, maybe even by other researchers down the line.
It really seems like this textbook is building a strong case for a very rigorous, almost scientific approach to investigation, which naturally leads to the idea of working with others, doesn't it? Collaboration.
What's interesting here, I think, is that the textbook explicitly frames collaboration as a cornerstone, just like it is in mainstream science. Sharing data, sharing methodologies, sharing findings. It argues this isn't just, nice to do. It's actually crucial for advancing understanding in this field, which has historically been quite fragmented.
Transparency seems vital then.
Exactly. The book really argues for openness and transparency. That includes sharing raw data and your methods whenever possible and appropriate. Why? Because that allows for replicability. Others can try to verify your findings. It builds credibility through potential peer review. And it helps avoid those isolated investigations where someone might come up with a potentially misleading interpretation because they didn't have access to broader data or perspectives.
So pooling resources and expertise helps everyone avoid working in a vacuum.
Right. And it also helps push back against the, let's face it, historical skepticism or stigma surrounding the topic itself. Well, the textbook acknowledges that stigma. It argues that by demonstrating a really evidence-based methodology, by being transparent and showing a willingness to collaborate with experts in established fields, investigators can enhance the credibility of the entire field and maybe attract more serious, qualified individuals, scientists, engineers, analysts to look at the data.
Okay, so how does the book suggest you actually do this networking and collaboration, practically speaking?
It gives some pretty concrete advice. When approaching experts in other fields, say an astronomer, a meteorologist, maybe an air traffic controller do it professionally, a simple, clear email is usually best. State your purpose clearly, show you respect their time and expertise, and ask specific, targeted questions related to your data.
So not just a vague, hey, I saw something weird, what do you think? But more like, based on this trajectory analysis and the lack of standard FAA lighting, could you help me assess if this could definitively be ruled out as a known conventional aircraft?
Precisely that. Much more focused and shows you've done your homework. The book also recommends attending relevant conferences or workshops. Maybe not specifically UFO ones, but in related fields like astronomy, atmospheric science, aviation. It's a way to meet experts, engage in serious discussions, maybe even present your own well-documented work if appropriate.
And online communities.
Participating thoughtfully in established online forums or networks related to these fields is also suggested. Not just UFO forums, but places where astronomers or pilots or weather enthusiasts hang out. Build connections in the right places by contributing meaningfully.
And it's about building relationships, not just one-off questions.
Yes, nurture those connections. Follow up, share relevant findings back with them if they helped, maybe offer assistance if you have relevant skills. The book also mentions potentially collaborating with established academic institutions or research organizations, perhaps offering to volunteer or assist with data analysis. This could provide access to better data, techniques, and expertise, but you absolutely have to respect their protocols and confidentiality agreements.
The textbook also uses historical cases, doesn't it, to kind of illustrate the points it's making about methodology and challenges.
Yeah, looking back at well-known past cases, both the successes and maybe the failures in how they were investigated, is presented as a really key learning tool. The book discusses several famous ones. Roswell from 1947 is brought up.
The classic.
Right. But it's discussed not to confirm any specific theory about what happened, but more to highlight the challenges. How hard it is to separate documented facts from later speculation and misinformation, how the narrative itself changed over time from weather balloon to secret project to other things. It emphasizes the need for critical examination of sources, considering the social and political context of the time. It uses Roswell as an example of why trying to secure actual physical evidence is important, even though the evidence trail there is messy, and why conducting meticulous contemporary interviews is vital.
What about Rendlesham Forest, the UK incident?
Rendlesham Forest, from 1980, is presented primarily as a case study focusing on eyewitness testimony. The book discusses the initial report by Lieutenant Colonel Halt, which was detailed but also subjective to the sketches made, and the notable lack of good photo or video evidence from the main encounters. It covers the subsequent investigations and the various explanations proposed over the years, natural phenomena, experimental aircraft, still unexplained.
What about the physical evidence there, the ground markings?
The unusual ground markings are mentioned as key evidence, yeah. But the book notes the ongoing debate about what actually caused them and points out the limitations of the forensic analysis done at the time. The real focus for Rendlesham, in the book, is on the eyewitness accounts. They're described as a rich source of information, but the book uses this case to hammer home the challenges. Inconsistencies between accounts, the potential impact of stress and fear on perception, memory distortion over time, the witness's psychological state, and why cross-referencing different accounts and with other data is absolutely vital. Rendlesham's enduring legacy, according to the text, really highlights both the power and the inherent challenges of relying heavily on eyewitness testimony, and the crucial need to analyze potential biases and influences on recall.
And the Phoenix Lights incident from '97, that was huge.
The Phoenix Lights case is analyzed for several aspects. The description of the object, that huge V-shaped formation of lights, its silent movement, the lack of conventional blinking lights. The book then discusses the photographic and video recordings that emerged.
Which were famously pretty variable in quality, right?
Exactly. Often taken under poor conditions by untrained individuals using the limited technology of the time. The book uses this to emphasize the need for careful, critical assessment of such images, always considering potential distortions, lighting issues, and the camera's own limitations. But Phoenix Lights also brings up another major issue the book covers elsewhere: social contagion.
Social contagion. You mean like the story spreading like wildfire and maybe changing as it went?
Precisely. The rapid spread of accounts, especially online even back then, the potential for elements of mass hysteria to creep in, and the subsequent difficulty for investigators to trace the origin of specific reports and assess the credibility of the very first accounts. The book uses it to discuss how information diffusion dynamics work, how social media, even in its earlier forms, can amplify claims and shape public perception. It also contrasts the limited consumer tech of 1997 with today's capabilities: high-res cameras, night vision, accessible radar data, showing how technology offers more potential data now, but also brings new challenges like managing huge data volumes and needing sophisticated analysis tools.
So looking at these historical cases through the lens of this textbook, it's less about definitively saying this is what happened and much more about learning practical lessons on how to investigate properly and understanding the common pitfalls and challenges.
What's fascinating here is that, yeah, the textbook consistently uses these historical examples not to push a specific explanation for any case, but to reinforce the core investigative principles it advocates throughout: the absolute need for rigor, the inherent difficulties with different types of evidence, the unreliability of human memory if it's not critically analyzed, and so on.
The book also kind of zooms out, doesn't it, to place this whole phenomenon or the investigation of it into a much broader context, connecting it to the bigger questions, like the search for life beyond Earth.
It does, yeah. It briefly touches on related scientific fields, most notably SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It mentions the different approaches, like using radio astronomy to listen for artificial signals, or optical SETI, which looks for brief, powerful laser pulses from distant stars. It notes the huge challenges, obviously, like sorting potential signals from cosmic noise or background light. It also touches on how technology, like advanced signal processing algorithms and AI machine learning, is starting to help tackle those challenges.
And it brings up the Drake equation I saw.
Yes, it lists the factors in the Drake equation, things like the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, FP, the number of habitable planets per system, and so on, down to the lifetime of a technological civilization, L. But it presents it mainly to illustrate just how speculative it is to try and estimate the number of communicative civilizations out there. So many of those factors are huge unknowns.
Which leads directly to that big, kind of unsettling question, the Fermi paradox. If the universe is so vast, why haven't we found clear evidence of anyone else? The Great Silence.
Exactly. And the book links this paradox directly to the ongoing enigma of UAPs. If intelligent life might be common, why the silence? The textbook outlines several hypotheses that scientists and philosophers discuss in relation to the Fermi paradox. Maybe advanced civilizations deliberately keep quiet, perhaps stay hidden, like the dark forest hypothesis suggests. Maybe it's dangerous to announce your presence.
Or maybe they just don't last long.
That's another idea. Perhaps technological civilizations tend to be short-lived, maybe due to self-destruction, resource depletion, environmental collapse. Or maybe the issue is with perhaps our current methods or our very perception are too limited. Maybe we're not looking for the right kind of evidence, or we can't recognize radically different forms of life or technology if we saw them.
It also mentions the rare Earth hypothesis as sort of a counter-argument to the idea that life is common.
Right. This hypothesis suggests that the specific combination of factors needed for complex, intelligent life like ours to evolve is actually exceptionally rare. It points to things like Earth having a large moon that stabilizes its axial tilt, our position in the galaxy, plate tectonics, a whole list of things that might be uncommon. It's presented as a reason for a more cautious appraisal when we think about the likelihood of finding other advanced life easily.
And the concept of the Great Filter.
Yeah, the idea that there's some major hurdle, some filter, that prevents most potential life from reaching a stage of interstellar communication or travel. The big question then becomes, where is that filter in relation to us? Is it in our deep past, meaning we somehow luckily passed it, like the jump to multicellular life? Is it something we're facing right now, like climate change or nuclear war? Or is it still in our future, meaning most advanced civilizations eventually hit a wall? The book uses these big picture concepts to provide a broader philosophical and scientific backdrop for thinking about the mystery of unexplained phenomena. It's not happening in a vacuum.
Okay, so we have this whole framework from the textbook.
Yeah?
The investigation methodology, the data analysis, the historical lessons, this huge philosophical context. But the book also tackles the real-world environment this all happens in. The media, public perception, and, let's be honest, the massive amount of misinformation out there.
Oh yeah, it dedicates a significant section to what it calls responsible reporting and dealing with misinformation. It really emphasizes that anyone investigating or reporting on these topics has a responsibility to prioritize accuracy above everything else. Avoid unsubstantiated claims, avoid sensationalism because that just damages credibility.
Yep.
You have to clearly distinguish between objective facts based on data and your own interpretation or speculation, and be upfront about the limitations of the data you have.
Media sensationalism must be a massive obstacle for anyone trying to do serious, careful work in this area.
Huge, absolutely huge. The textbook points out how it undermines credibility, actively creates confusion and misinformation. And now, with the speed and reach of social media, things can go viral vehemently, whether they're accurate or not. It also touches on how information or disinformation can sometimes be manipulated, maybe for financial gain, maybe even for political reasons. And while citizen journalism empowers people, the book notes the challenge. There's often a lack of fact-checking or editorial oversight, making it easy for false or misleading information to spread very quickly.
So how does the book suggest we fight back against all that noise and bad information?
It really calls for improving media literacy and critical thinking skills, both for investigators and for the general public. People need to learn how to identify unreliable sources, how to spot signs of manipulation in photos or videos, and understand why certain narratives or stories get amplified while others don't. Education is presented as a key tool here. It also suggests using reputable fact-checking websites and making an effort to rely on credible, established sources of information whenever possible.
And what about the media outlets themselves? Any responsibility there?
The book argues they absolutely have a responsibility. They need to try and move away from just chasing clicks with sensational headlines and prioritize accuracy, context, and nuance. It stresses the importance of accountability when media outlets spread unsubstantiated claims, and it encourages investigating the origins of misinformation, not just repeating it. This ties back to the public needing to understand our own cognitive biases too, things like confirmation bias again, but also the availability heuristic, where we tend to overestimate the importance of things that are easily recalled, often because they were dramatic or reported frequently, even if they're rare or unrepresentative.
What about the history of government secrecy around UFOs? Project Blue Book, classification. How does the textbook view the impact of that?
What's fascinating here is how the textbook explicitly connects that history of secrecy. It mentions examples like Blue Book's perceived lack of transparency, or ongoing issues with classification directly to the erosion of public trust. It argues that secrecy fuels conspiracy theories and actively hinders objective scientific analysis because researchers can't access potential data. It acknowledges that military and intelligence agencies might have relevant technology or data access, but their institutional need for secrecy creates a fundamental conflict with scientific openness and transparency, breeding mistrust.
So the textbook strongly advocates for more transparency then?
Very strongly. It calls for things like clear, publicly known protocols for reporting and investigating UAP incidents. It suggests external audits or independent verification of official investigations whenever feasible as a way to build accountability and public trust. It even touches on the broader ethical implications if truly transformative information were being discovered and withheld from the public. Transparency is presented as essential for progress.
Looking forward then, how does the textbook see the future of UFO investigation evolving? What's next?
Technology is definitely seen as a major driver of change. The book discusses advancements that are becoming more accessible. Things like multispectral or hyperspectral imaging cameras, which can potentially gather information about the materials an object is made of by analyzing light beyond the visible spectrum. Miniaturization of sensors is another point, allowing for deployment on drones, high-altitude balloons, creating sensor networks, and the ability to integrate data from multiple sensor platforms simultaneously for better triangulation and tracking.
And AI has to be a big part of that future, right? Dealing with all the data.
Oh yeah. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are highlighted as crucial. Primarily, like you said, for tackling the sheer volume of data that modern sensors can generate. AI can help automate the analysis process, potentially spotting subtle patterns or anomalies in data that a human analyst might miss. It can also be used to enhance footage quality, things like super resolution to improve detail or advanced noise reduction. Object detection, classification, tracking movements across different sensors. These are all areas where the book sees AI playing a vital, growing role.
What about the rise of citizen science? Everyone has a smartphone with a decent camera now. Drones are common.
The book definitely discusses this democratization of data collection. It empowers many more people to potentially capture evidence. But the book is also quite cautious here. It highlights the significant challenges this presents. How do you verify the data coming from thousands of untrained individuals using consumer-grade equipment? How do you organize it all? It stresses the absolute need for robust verification processes, cross-referencing reports, using sophisticated image and video analysis techniques to check for manipulation, looking for triangulation opportunities between different observers, and carefully assessing the credibility of the source.
And beyond just photos and videos, are other kinds of data becoming more important in this future view?
Yes, the book circles back to the value of analyzing other sensory data. Audio recordings, for instance, might capture subtle sound features associated with an event, and it reiterates the importance of radar data, whenever available, as a source of objective measurement, providing precise position, speed, and trajectory information that subjective visual estimates often lack. And then there's this concept it calls data fusion.
Bringing it all together.
Exactly. Integrating all these different types of data. Visual sightings, photos, videos, audio recordings, radar tracks, maybe even analyzed witness testimony data into a single, comprehensive picture. The goal is to build a more holistic understanding of an event than any single data stream could provide. The book notes, though, that this requires developing standards for data formats and ensuring different systems and databases can actually talk to each other effectively. Interoperability is key.
So it sounds like while technology is offering powerful new tools and generating way more data, the textbook keeps coming back to that theme of collaboration being essential.
What's interesting here, I think, is how the textbook concludes that collaboration is not just helpful, but absolutely essential for the future of meaningful investigation. Sharing data ethically, sharing new techniques, networking with reputable organizations and experts across different fields, engaging in peer review of findings. It's all framed as leveraging collective intelligence to tackle a complex problem. It mentions using online platforms, shared digital workspaces, and cloud storage as practical tools to facilitate this collaboration.
And doing it responsibly.
Absolutely. The book stresses the need for responsible collaboration. That includes protecting witness privacy through things like anonymization and ensuring data security. And it circles back again to that critical point, always clearly distinguishing between the raw data itself and any interpretations or conclusions drawn from it when sharing information with others.
Okay, so having really dug into this textbook from Bald and Bonker's Network Academy, gone through its principles, its methods, the context it provides, let's circle back to our original question. Does it actually seem like it provides a solid foundation for someone wanting to investigate this stuff seriously?
You know, if we connect all these threads, I'd say yes. The textbook clearly makes a concerted effort to lay a foundation built squarely on, well, scientific rigor, on critical skepticism, on the need for incredibly meticulous data collection protocols. It consistently acknowledges the limitations of human perception, limitations of technology. It stresses ethical conduct throughout. And it hammers home the necessity of collaboration.
So it tries to shift the focus away from just arguing about what these things are and onto the fundamental, how do you investigate them reliably and credibly?
Exactly. It really highlights the complexity involved.
Yeah.
It shows that investigating properly isn't just about casually looking up at the sky. It requires real dedication to detailed documentation, objective analysis, and that rigorous critical thinking, often needing input from multiple disciplines.
It definitely reinforces that these core principles, objectivity, thoroughness, skepticism, transparency, collaboration, they're essential for anyone who wants to seriously inquire into unexplained aerial phenomena and have their work taken seriously. The goal, as the book consistently frames it, is to pursue objective truth, whatever that turns out to be, not just to confirm your own pet theories.
Yeah, it's about documenting accurately, analyzing carefully, and then finding the most likely explanation based only on the evidence you've gathered, not based on assumptions or desires.
The textbook's concluding thoughts really seem to underline this commitment, don't they? The importance of intellectual honesty, ethical practice, collaborating widely, maybe contributing findings through scholarly channels if possible, maintaining integrity by avoiding sensationalism.
Respecting the scientific method by acknowledging uncertainty and limitations, being willing to revise your conclusions if new evidence emerges, engaging in open data sharing and peer review where appropriate. Yeah, sets a high bar.
It positions investigation as this continuous, challenging process, one that demands dedication, definitely open-mindedness, but always, always tempered by critical thinking and a strong adherence to method.
I think that's a fair summary of its core message, yeah.
So what does this deep dive into the textbook mean for you, the listener, if you're fascinated by this topic? Well, it suggests the path towards potentially understanding unexplained phenomena isn't paved with wild speculation or grainy anonymous videos. Instead, this textbook argues it's built through diligent, careful work, disciplined skepticism, and a real commitment to rigorous, transparent methods. It's essentially a call to become a responsible investigator, armed with the right tools and maybe more importantly, the right mindset. And as you continue to think about this ongoing mystery, the challenges of getting good evidence, the complexities of human perception, the sheer vastness of the universe and the possibility of life elsewhere, maybe consider this final thought, something woven through the book's discussion of the Fermi paradox and that great silence. What if the lack of clear, undisputed evidence for other civilizations or the often fleeting, enigmatic nature of these phenomena? What if it isn't just about mind-boggling distances or the possibility that life is incredibly rare? Could the apparent silence, or the way these things seem to manifest, be telling us something profound about the nature of advanced technological civilizations themselves? Perhaps they don't last very long. Perhaps they evolve in ways we can't currently comprehend, interacting with reality differently. Or could the key to the paradox lie not entirely out there, in the stars, but at least partly within us? Within the limitations of our current perception, our current technology, and perhaps even the fundamental assumptions we make about what we're looking for and how we should be looking.
Keep learning, keep questioning, but always with that critical mind the textbook advocates. And keep thinking about both the phenomenon itself and the best, most rigorous methods we can possibly use to try and understand it.